Good evening, good afternoon, good morning from wherever you are attending our first international coffee break today. I am Carol Gomez, Director of the English Program in Santiago, and we, the English Program and the International Relations Office from Adolfo Ibáñez University, want to give you the warmest welcome to this event we have prepared specially for you. The International Coffee Break series originated as an inviting, friendly, and interactive opportunity to engage in conversation with international speakers and at the same time put our English into practice. Because of that, our host and hostess today are part of our UAI community, so please welcome Maria de Los Angeles, first-year law student in Viña del Mar, and Niels, first-year business student in Santiago. Hi guys, how are you tonight?
Hi, Carol. Hi, everyone. I'm great. How about you, Niels?
Hi, guys. I'm doing just great. Well, tonight is our pleasure to have the CEO and founder of Diversity Abroad, Andrew Gordon, and he's going to share with us his talk titled Confronting Systemic Racism. You will have the chance to interact with him in a couple of minutes. But what's going to happen now, Maria Los Angeles?
Well, before our guest speaker to warm up, Flor Toledo, the director of the English program in Viña del Mar, will tell us what our first activity is about.
Hi, everyone. We will spend the next 10 minutes in small groups. I've just sent you a PDF with 3 questions to answer in small groups. Please download the document to your computer and click Entrar or Join when you see the message on your screen. Let's get back together in a while. So, is Andrew here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so we are going to start now. So let me say these words first. So guys, welcome back to the main room. We hope you all had a great talk in your small groups. Now that you have warmed up, it's time to leave Andrew. Please feel at home. We are very happy to have you here.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. And I guess it's good evening to most of you. I'm chiming in from California, from Oakland, California. If you're not familiar, Oakland, California is in Northern California, right across the bay from San Francisco. But Oakland's better than San Francisco. I have a lot of friends that live in San Francisco, so I have to say that. And thanks to Flor, to Carlos, your entire team for inviting me here. So we have a heavy topic to discuss tonight, systemic racism. It's obviously something that our society as a whole, not just in the US, but the world is talking about right now. But to get started, I want to tell you a little bit about myself, about the work that I do with an organization called Diversity Abroad, and really how systems of inequities and exclusion motivated me to start this organization now 14 years ago, which is crazy to say that. I am the grandson of a sharecropper. If you're not familiar with sharecropping, I encourage you to do some research on it. It was a kind of an economic system that was used after slavery during a period of time in the United States called Reconstruction, which was it was an economic system that really didn't provide any type of opportunity for economic growth or prosperity. And so that was what my grandfather did. And then my grandmother and my grandfather on my mother's side, my mom's parents, they moved to California during a period of time that was called the Great Migration. And you may have heard of the Great Migration before, but what it was a period of time where many Black Americans moved from the South. When you think of the South, you think of Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. So many moved from the South to northern cities, New York, Boston, Chicago, and they moved west to California. And my family moved west to California. And really one of the main drivers behind this was for economic opportunity. So it was a form of immigration. So it's interesting when we talk now about immigration, how people from different parts of not just Latin and South America, but just different parts of the world want to come to, will go to the different countries for immigration. That was very much the experience of Black Americans who moved from the South of the U.S. to other parts of the U.S. So that was a little bit of like how my family ended up in California. Fast forward, my parents, they met, they got married, loved, it was great. And both my parents went to college, and they had us. I have 3 siblings, and myself and my older brother went to university. And one day, I was living at home still. My older brother is about 2 years older than me. I was living at home, and my older brother comes home, and he's very excited, and he says to my parents, "I'm going to go study abroad. I'm going to go study abroad." Well, my parents had gone to college, but they never studied abroad. And, for the people who were my parents' age growing up, international travel wasn't something that the Black community did. So my parents were excited for my brother. I was too, but no one really knew what it was. And so anyway, short story, my brother went to study in Spain, and I went to visit him. And that was my first time being away from home for a long period of time. And I traveled around Spain with my brother in different parts of Europe. And that motivated me to want to study abroad. And so I went to study abroad in Mexico. I did a summer program in a city called Cuernavaca in Mexico. It's a little south of Mexico City. And it was great. I had a phenomenal experience. And then, and I don't know if I told this to Carlos and Flor, but then maybe 6 months later, I did another study abroad to South America. And I was in Brazil and I was in Chile. And it was a short one. It was like a 2-week program with one of my professors. It was fun. Actually, when we were in Chile, I don't know if it's still around. We went to this winery. It was called Concha y Toro. I think Concha y Toro, something like that. Anyway, it was like a business trip. And so we were learning about the business of making wine. So anyway, I'll stick to the script because I'll go off on that story. That was a fun trip. But then fast forward again, right after I graduated, or after I got back from the South America trip, about 6 months later, I went and I spent a semester studying abroad in Spain, in southern Spain, in this town called Sevilla. Had a phenomenal time, and it was great. So how did all this kind of lead me to starting diversity abroad? Well, after graduating, I was looking to go back to school, and I had thought about all the different experiences I had, and how I thought those experiences were changing me as a person. And I kept going back to my study abroad experiences and how living in a different country, in a different culture, how unique it was. But there was 2 things about the study abroad experience that I would say motivated me to start diversity abroad. The first experience was one that happened in Spain. And so this is in the early 2000s. And where I was in Spain, in Sevilla, there weren't a lot of Black people. Most of the Black people who were there, I would say, were immigrants from different parts of Africa who had come to Spain for a better life, like immigrants often do. And I remember having a conversation with some of my friends, some of my Spanish friends, and them asking me a question. They said, "Where are you from?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm from California." They're like, "No. Where's your family from?" I was like, "Well, I grew up in San Diego in the south of California, but now I live in Northern California." And they're like, No. Where's your family like from before California? I was like, "Oh, my grandparents, they're from the south. Like I told you all, they're from Mississippi." It's like, "No, Andrew, where in Africa is your family from?" And I was like, "Oh my goodness, these are young adults that had no idea about the transatlantic slave trade and how Africans ended up in the US. And they were very sincere, but what one of the things I appreciated was that the Black experience, the Black American experience, isn't the normal experience that people think of when they think of the American experience. The American experience is often viewed through the lens of the white experience. And so that was one thing that had an influence, that experience had an influence of me starting diversity abroad. The second thing was the fact that when I thought back to my study abroad experiences, particularly when I was in Spain, it was a large program. It was probably 100 students, maybe a little bit more. And of all of those students, I was one of maybe 4 or 5 Black students. And so I had this experience that had such a profound impact on my life, but then it was like students like me, young people like me didn't do it. So anyway, fast forward, I went back, I'm back home, I'm doing research, I'm planning to go back to school, and I started doing research on study abroad, diversity, racism, and all those things. And there was no organization that was solely focused on diversity, equity, inclusion in global education and study abroad. So I said, start the organization. And that's the genesis of diversity abroad. But the reason I tell you that story is that the work that I do now is very much driven by work that pertains to breaking down systems of racism, systems of exclusion, systems of oppression in the education space, particularly in the global education space. But when we talk about, want to give you that as a foundation, but when we talk about more broadly systemic racism, first I think it's important to understand how most people have traditionally viewed racism. If you would ask someone, are you a racist? People will say, no, I'm not a racist. No, absolutely not. Well, really what they were saying was that I personally don't agree with violence against people because of their race, or I personally don't agree with people being discriminated against because of the color of their skin and so on and so forth. So they're really looking at it from an individual standpoint, saying like, I don't believe in these very egregious things. And so that's why when you saw the murder, really there was a string of murders that culminated with the murder of George Floyd, and it sparked this huge wave of like anger and protest, and it's going on in some places. It continues to. What many Black people would tell you in the U.S. Particularly is that yes, that was in part because of how egregious and how savage the killing of George Floyd was, but that's just one form of racism, and that's the most, again, kind of the most egregious. But the experience that many, we use the term BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, experience on a daily basis is more systemic, is more structural. So it's easy to point out, like killing somebody. That's very easy to point out. That's in your face. But the thing that we see that is having almost an even greater impact on Black lives and lives of other people of color is, again, the things that are a little bit more systemic. Think, for an example, the experience right now in the U.S. from what's happening with COVID-19. A disproportionate number of the people who are dying are Black, are Hispanic, Latino. That's like the disproportionate number of people who are dying. Why is that the case? Well, part of it is that from a health standpoint, often we see Black populations and Hispanic populations and other populations that don't have adequate access to healthcare on a normal basis. And so then it's easier for sicknesses and diseases to linger with them longer. Well, why don't they have access to healthcare? Well, healthcare costs money. It costs a lot of money in the US. Well, who has money? Why? Well, Black populations and other populations have less, and I'll get into this in a second, have less wealth than white populations. So you start to see how all of these things are kind of interconnected in a way. And that's just what the example of COVID is, just one example of how systemic racism plays out in a very subtle way, not necessarily kind of in your face. And sometimes you take a step back and you question, is like, wait, well, how is this the case? Like, how is this the case? I'm sure many of you have learned about the civil rights movement in the U.S. So many of you learned about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, or even the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And if you haven't, I encourage you to learn about that period of history in the U.S., because what we're experiencing now, you would think we would be in a completely different place, but we're not. And so although the passing after the civil rights movement, there were more rights that Black Americans and other Americans of color had, really, when we think about systemic racism and how it still impacts our society, we see it in a few places. We see it in employment. We see it in educational attainment. We see it in healthcare, like I just mentioned a moment ago. Career mobility. There's a variety of ways in which we see systemic racism. So I want to give you a couple of statistics, a couple of things to think about when we think about how, systemic racism plays out. So one is the wealth gap. So wealth in the U.S. or everywhere is kind of how many assets, your assets minus your liabilities. So if I have $10,000 in the bank, but I owe $15,000, my wealth is a negative $5,000. If I have $10,000 in the bank, but I owe nothing, then my wealth is $10,000. So that's when we talk about wealth. So a couple of statistics. In 2010, Black Americans comprised of 13% of the overall U.S. population, but we only had 2.7% of the country's wealth. Another kind of statistic to think about is that the average financial net worth, like I just talked about a second ago, the average net worth of a white family is a white family in the U.S. is $134,000. The average net worth of a Hispanic or Latino family is $14,000. Of a Black family, it's $11,000. As you see, these huge kind of disparities. What's interesting, you take employment. Obviously, employment, having a good job is part of the driver of wealth. At any point in the last 5 to 6 decades, there was almost double the number of Black people who were unemployed than that of white people in the U.S. And so we know employment helps obviously drive wealth, helps you have access to healthcare, to good food, all of those things. We know double the number of Black folks have been unemployed than that of white people. One of the biggest drivers for wealth creation in most places is housing, is being able to own a house. Well, Black people were discriminated against when it came to getting houses, to getting favorable getting mortgages or at all, or favorable mortgages. But it's not just that. When we think about how Black folks are positioned in certain areas of cities where, oftentimes, unfortunately, society talks about those areas of cities in a very negative way. Well, a lot of times those are areas of cities where there might be greater crime, less access to healthcare, less access to fresh food, the kind of things that keep you healthy, that sustain you. So again, we think about systemic racism is not just that in your face, is these more subtle things that impact folks on a day-to-day basis. And so, broadly, we're talking about the U.S., but you can think of other examples of systemic racism, things that are blatant, like apartheid in South Africa, or other more subtle forms of racism that we may see. There's certain places in the world where lighter skin is always viewed as better than darker skin. How does that impact the kind of employment opportunities that people of darker skin can have versus those of lighter skin? And so when we start to think about these things, what we appreciate is that when we say systemic racism, it's just that. It's systemic. It's systemic. It's all kind of woven together. And so when we say, well, how do we address it? How do we attack it? Well, we have to attack it through a systemic way. Is one thing to say, I'm going to be out on the streets and I'm marching, and if that's what people want to do, to march and protest, thankfully in most countries, people have the right to express their views. But really, to address systemic racism, it's more than protesting. It's more than somebody changing the color of their logo black. It's more than putting out a statement that says Black Lives Matter and so on and so forth. That's all nice, but that's not going to get us where we need to get. To address it, we have to look at it from a systemic way. What are the practices? What are the policies? What are the systems in place that allow for certain populations Black, Indigenous population, people of color, to be marginalized when it comes to education, to healthcare, to employment, to wealth? What are the systems that allow that to happen? And it is a little bit of a trade-off, because many of those systems, they propel the white population. The white population has certain benefits that that other populations don't. And so, how do we start to disrupt that? To disrupt that? And I always say there's a kind of four ways, like kind of 4 A's that I use. It's first is awareness. So one, being aware that it exists. It's for all of you in the cities and the countries that you're in, a kind of awareness, like where my systemic racism exists in my city, in my country. And then assessment of the spaces that you're in, your communities, your families, school, work, and so on and so forth. How can you address systemic racism in the areas where you have influence? And then taking action to do it. So it's one thing to say, okay, assess, I know I need to do this. Then it's like taking the action to actually do it. And then fourth is the accountability, holding yourself and your communities accountable to breaking down or dismantling systems of racism. And so there's not necessarily there's no silver bullet. There's no just like wave a wand and bam, like systemic racism is gone. It doesn't work like that. This has been centuries in the making. So it's not going to be the summer of 2020 we decide that systemic racism is a thing and we get rid of it. Really, what it is that it's individuals in your cities, in your countries, and your places of influence, looking internal first and saying, what might be some of the things that I do that perpetuate systemic racism? And then saying, how can I be part of the solution and dismantling it? So thanks for giving me a few minutes to chat with you about this. Again, it's a really deep topic. I know we don't have enough time to delve into like the depths of it, but look forward to chatting and answering some of your questions as well.
Wow, Andrew, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. That was amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now it is time for questions, and we would like to invite our audience to share their insights with us by raising hands or typing their questions in the chat.
Okay, so the first question is, can we talk about your personal reaction to this moment?
Yeah, that's a deep question. You know, I haven't watched the video. Like, I haven't watched the George Floyd video. Like, I refuse to watch it. I mean, I think everybody's different. I think you'll find, you know, some folks that need to see it to kind of feel them. And I think you'll find a lot of Black folks who are like, hey, we've been terrorized for a long time. Like, I don't need to watch it on TV to know what it is. And it's not, and you know, and I want to say, I think that, again, I think George Floyd video, that was just like, that was the catalyst. I mean, you had Brown Taylor, who got killed in her house while she was sleeping before that. And I mean, you see this string of like killings and murders and things that happen, and it's like, this continues to happen. And then it happens, and there's outrage, and people protest, and people are angry, and it continues to happen. So I think everyone deals with it differently. I mean, I think for me, it was, I think obviously with everyone, just the stress that people were going through given COVID-19 right now, that was just something that, you know, in some ways, I think many look at it and say, if it wasn't for COVID-19, people will probably be just going about their day-to-day lives like we normally are, you know, consumed with so many different things. And, you know, the string of murders that we saw over the last 5-6 months could have just been, you know, a one-day news story and gone. But the fact that everybody was kind of watching TV in their houses and things like that, it's like you couldn't avoid it. So there's an aspect of what's happening and saying that this moment that we're in, it was the perfect storm in a lot of ways.
We have another question from Vicente Munoz. Vicente, would you like to?
Yeah. Hi, Andrew. First of all, I want to say that I love San Francisco. I visited Oakland. It's amazing. I'm a Warriors fan. Yeah. I'm a Warriors
go
fan.
Warriors.
Yeah. So here's my question. Like, from in the U.S., where do you think it lacks more when it comes to racism? Is it like a law standpoint, or is it like a societal standpoint? Where do you think it lacks more taking care of it more?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So laws are driven by society, so laws that get enacted are because there's enough pressure usually somewhere that someone's going to say, okay, we need to act this particular law. So frankly, it's been I would say like those in power or those with the most power have been white folks, and it has continued because white folks have allowed to continue. And that's, you look at power structures, that's it. That's just, it's kind of how it is. So there's been this need for, particularly for the white community, to stand up and say, hey, enough is enough. Because when you look at like power structures at every level of our society, from government to business to education, when you look at the power structure, is white folks who are in that power structure. People go back and say, hey, but you guys had, Barack Obama was like president, he was a black man, and so on and so forth. Absolutely, but the office of the presidency is not a king. There's only so much you can do from that standpoint. So there comes a point where like the population that's benefiting from the oppression of people of color have to look and say, okay, enough, to be able to really galvanize. And that's what helps galvanize laws and things like that. You can look back to the civil rights movement. It was when, again, a lot of white folks started getting engaged, that's when that momentum happened. So excellent question.
Thank you, Andrew, for the question. Next, there is Lucas Vallevela, who has raised his hand. So where is he?
Hi, Andrew.
Hey, Lucas.
So my question is about a new term that I hadn't heard like ever, which is culture appropriation.
Yeah.
Well, basically in Chile, we're quite distant from racism itself, the way you live it in America. So it's a term that I found really difficult to understand in a way that I relate to it. Obviously, like distantly, but like still relate to it in some way. So I don't know if you could like talk about some of it or try to explain it in like a way that I could like relate a little bit to it.
Yeah, so I'm trying to how you can relate a little bit to it. Well, just kind of an example of like, right? So you could take something traditional Native American garb, I'm dressed and so on and so forth. Like, if I decide that for the fun of it, I want to have, say, an Indian party, which is not an appropriate term to use, like, and I want to dress in traditional cultural wear of the Native Americans, having no connection to the community, not knowing it all, and like, this is just something fun for me. It's like you're taking someone else's culture to do something fun. You don't know about the culture. Like, that's something that they may take very serious or very personal. And for you, it's just like, I don't have to think about it. I can do whatever I want with that. And there's a lot of pushback with folks saying, it's not that we don't want to share our culture. It's not that we don't want to celebrate our culture, but our culture isn't a joke. Our culture isn't just something that's like, fun for you to do without you really being interested in. And there's a lot of sensitivity around that as a whole. I'm trying to think of an example in Chile. There's not one that's coming to my mind right now. But that's kind of that example of like how folks would kind of take people's like dress and things like that. I think for a lot of communities is very, very deeply offensive. And there are things that are just like, yeah, I would just leave that. I think for a lot of communities, it becomes something that's deeply offensive. And so there's different ways of engaging with culture. There's different ways of like understanding someone's background and so on and so forth. And like me dressing up as you is not necessarily the most productive way to do it, and it could be, again, highly offensive to some folks.
So is it like appropriating about it? Would it be like because you're mocking them, or is it because you're being ignorant towards the culture?
So it could be, yeah, that's a good question. It could be a combination of both, right? So it could be like, hey, I'm just like totally ignorant to the culture, but I'm going to take this thing from them that seems like fun and do it. It's like, well, why not learn about the culture and engage in the culture? And you might understand that, well, dressing up like X could be highly offensive, so I'm not going to do that. But if it's like no thought to that at all, it's just like, I'm just going to go kind of full force with this because it seems like something fun, then that's where I think you run afoul a lot.
It's just the like why I find it so difficult, because like one of the things that went like really popular around the time of the George Floyd murder around social media was like people, women especially, apologizing because at some point of their lives they wore braids in their hair, and apparently that was appropriating from a culture, an African culture, or something about it. And I couldn't really understand how that was like offensive in any way.
Yeah.
Like, because I just thought like, well, it's a hairstyle. Like, is it really that bad?
Yeah.
So that's like really where I was coming from.
Yeah, and Lucas, I think one of the things is that I would say everyone's not going to be equally offended by, right? So you might find a Black person that they're not offended by that, and you might find some that are highly offended by it. But sometimes I think is understanding the moment that we're in, and at times when someone says like, "Hey, this is something that's really offensive to me," even if you don't understand, sometimes it's like I gotta default to, there's something about this. This is obviously something connected to this culture. There's something about what I'm doing, even if I don't understand, that's deeply offensive. And so let me just like take a step back and try to learn and educate myself, and then find out, hey, why, like, really what is I want to understand. And what I find as a whole is that when when you approach people and say, hey, I really want to understand this, most people are willing to say, hey, this is why this was like offensive to me, or this is like what this means, and so on and so forth. And so there's aspects of that. I mean, there's aspects of what I didn't use this particular term earlier, but I kind of like performative allyship, or performative, like, oh my gosh, I wore braids back in 1980 when I was 16. I'm the worst person in the world. It's like, okay, do you really think you're the worst person in the world, or is it kind of like this moment that you're caught up in? So, like, what are you actually like really doing, not just like the kind of show behind it?
Thank you, Lucas, and thank you, Andrew. We have a next question from Mercedes Pino. Mercedes?
Hi, Andrew. My question is related to systematic racism, but it's more of a political point because, as you know, like the United States elections are coming up. So, especially the United States is a very polarized country when it comes to like the Democrats and the Republicans. And all that is like the Black Lives Matter movement especially has caused a lot of debate within the United States. And it's sort of seen generalized that people who go with the Black Lives Matter are more Democrat, those who are more racist, more Republican. So it's something that's caused a lot of spur within the United States. So my biggest question is, how do you get such a polarized country to unite to work for systematic racism?
Yeah, listen, if I had the answer, I'd be like on an island somewhere, like retired. I know, but I think what you said, I mean, you really hit it right on. I mean, it's like, I think to myself is like, why is my humanity like political? Like, why should my ability to live and walk? Yeah, it shouldn't be political at all. And so I think what you have, and I think unfortunately in the U.S. right now is, becoming the situation where it's like, if you like blue and you're a Republican, I'm a Democrat, then I hate blue. Like, who cares? Like, as like, who cares? It's like, I'm gonna hate it, and that's unfortunate. I'll say two things like that. I think you see a lot of that, and kind of like this tribalism of like us versus them, and so on and so forth. And so it becomes challenging at times. Now, that said, two things I'll say. One, there's like reality, and then there's like the media. And frankly, I'm not like one of those like, oh, the fake news. I'm not like that. But what I will say is that when you look at the business model for media, their business model is eyes. Like they need eyes so they can sell ads, and ridiculousness gets eyes. And so they're, from a business perspective, I think they are. There's a benefit for them to kind of show these very two polarized sides. I've had the opportunity to travel all over this country, in the South, in the Midwest, and I've sat down next to folks that were staunch Trump supporters and so on and so forth, and having conversations with people. It's like, people are people. Like, people may think very differently about certain things, but like, people are people. So I think there's that aspect. It's like understanding that there's yes, divisions, absolutely, but there is a level of hype too. So kind of the balance between them. The other thing I would say, and this is like kind of seen this since the again, when I say murder George Floyd, like that being the catalyst, because there were several that came before him. But since that, you've seen an increased percentage of the U.S. population who have said racism is a big issue. They agree with the Black Lives Matter movement as well. So you're seeing those numbers go up, and people that are agreeing with what broadly the goals around Black Lives Matter, and owning to the fact that racism is such a challenge in this country.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mercedes, for the question. And the last one is from Agustin Aravena.
Andrew.
Hey, Agustin.
So I have a question. Do you think that the U.S. have the U.S. In the beginning, like I'm talking 1779, was based mostly on agricultural economic,
Mm-hmm.
right? So do you think the U.S. has somehow took the culture of the agriculture economic system to the 21st century, and that involves the people of color, or particularly black people, to be particularly discriminated because in some sort of way they are seen as cheap labor. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sorry to say it like that, but
No, it's fine.
My mind about something better.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, I would say that's a great question. I mean, so I think it's important to understand with what brought Black folks to the U.S. slavery it was economics. I mean, that was it wasn't necessarily a deep hatred for Black people. It was like economics, and that was part of what brought Black labor to the U.S. And I would still say that Black labor is undervalued. Black folks make less money than I and a white person can have the same job, and I'm going to make less money. I'm a Black woman, I'm going to make that much more less money. And it's the same thing with I would say with the Hispanic Latino population as well in the U.S. I think particularly with that population from a labor standpoint. So you look at labor as far as in agricultural. I think you look at other positions. There's certain positions where I would say the Hispanic Latino community in the U.S. is viewed as doing certain types of jobs that might seem more service oriented or agriculturally oriented types of jobs as a whole. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think agriculture still plays a role. And you see certain populations that are in certain groups. They use certain roles. I want to say one thing. I know my time is up. I can keep going, but we talked a lot about obviously like the Black experience, the Hispanic Latino experience. But we appreciate, I think in the U.S. A lot of is not just those populations. I think you see the discrimination against the Asian population with COVID-19. You've seen that obviously from our president in a lot of different ways. Discrimination against the Asian community. And then even within the Asian community, you have like the East Asian community and the Southeast Asian community, and there's different levels of discrimination that comes from there. but a lot of the, what I will say is a lot of the types of like policies and attitudes towards different races, negative ones, the genesis of that were attitudes and policies towards Black people in the U.S. And so that's you see again how systemic it is and how long it's been here. And I think one of the important things is conversations like this, because it takes us being able to have the conversation, name it, talk through it to begin to make some progress. So I'm just really excited to have had this time with all of you to discuss this.
Well, I'm sorry for the rest of the guys who had their hands up to talk, to ask their questions. But well, we would like to thank you, Andrew, for your kind participation in this coffee break session. We would like to keep in touch. Follow Diversity Abroad on Instagram @DiversityAbroad. So Andrew, thank you very much for this talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank all of you. Thank you for having me, and thanks everybody for joining.
We would love to continue talking to you, Andrew, and sharing with the great attendees we had today. Everyone was very participative, so thank you. But unfortunately, time goes by really fast when we have fun, and we have to say goodbye. Thank you for participating in our first coffee break talk, and we look forward to our next one on September 10th. Next time, we will have a woman named Chantal Balestri in a talk called What's the Sound of Music During Pandemic? I hope to see you all there because it is going to be great. And please answer a quick survey we have shared with you. It won't take you more than 2 minutes. Thank you and see you in the next coffee break. Bye everyone. Bye Andrew.
Bye.
Bye Andrew.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye guys. Thank you very much for coming. Bye Andrew.
Thank
you, Andrew.
you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Please
Bye. Thank you.
answer the questions. Don't forget to answer, guys.
Bye. Thank you very much. Bye.
Hi.